We are in the midst of a re-enchantment of the world. Everyone has some kind of skill, whether they know it or not, in this domain. Magic is real. For the magic to work, you have to believe that it's going to work. There's some form of deep interconnectedness among all things. That's simply part of the fabric of reality. It transcends space and time. The fact that we're aware is a very deep mystery. It's still not solved. There's tons of data saying that these psychic effects really are real. Galileo, like others, are very well aware that anything having to do with magic is okay within the church, but it is not okay outside. It's demonic. There's danger in anything, especially when we're dealing with getting a better sense of who and what you are, what you might be capable of. You can get pulled into a bad place pretty quickly. You just end up going completely psychotic, go crazy. You don't gain power without having something challenging yourself. Black magic is considered to be overriding somebody else's free will. If you don't have the permission to do it, you're asking for trouble. The point of enchantment magic is that you're instantiating a desire, an intention. You're taking it out of your mind and putting it out into the world. The easiest practice that kind of attracts people now is I proposed as part of my work to start looking at the mind-machine interaction as an actual thing. Like if somebody was very anxious, the machine seems to fail. And a lot of people are familiar with this for something as simple as, I really, really need to get a photocopy right now. And somehow that's the time when I press the button on the photocopy machine that it breaks. Well, enough people are familiar with this that
Yes.
I figured, okay, there's like a face validity to the idea that if you're really anxious, that the machine is not going to obey you very well. So I spent some time as part of my business travel to visit the various laboratories in the United States where they were doing mind matter interaction studies and spoke to the researchers, and one of them very kindly loaned to me one of the devices they were using for testing mind matter interaction. And so I brought it back to the labs, and I was using myself as a subject and my colleagues. And I convinced myself after a while there really is a direct mind matter interaction that you can measure with a machine. And so this became relevant because now I was saying that, well, maybe this folklore that develops about people interacting with machines, it's actually a real thing. It's not some mundane explanation, but there's something about human anxiety or human intention that will cause a machine to break. And so that got me really interested. So I went to a conference, I presented this, and later was invited by people working on, at the time, a classified program in the United States that was using psychic phenomena for espionage. Today, it's known as the Stargate program. It was a program for 20 years using remote viewing, which is the same as clairvoyance, as a way of getting information that would be useful for espionage. So there were rumors at the time that maybe something like this was happening, but they were rumors. Well, now I learned that it was actually a real thing. And so I spent a year on that program as a visiting scientist, and that completely blew my mind because it was no longer seeing seeing that I could see these results in the lab, but finding that this was taken very, very seriously at the highest levels of government because it was useful, not just a minor uh, minor anomalous glitch that you could find scientifically, but actually pragmatically useful. So I determined at that point that if it was possible to continue a career as a scientist to try to understand these phenomena and look into them in detail, that's what I wanted to do. So I somehow figured out a way of doing that. That's what I've been doing for 40 years now. So what is the connection to magic? The connection is I've written a number of books, and the first one was all about the nature of the data and how we know that these are real effects. The second one was about the physics underneath it, why it doesn't violate anything that we know about physics. The third was about the yoga traditions and how within classical yoga that these phenomena known as the siddhis in yogic terms are very real and have been known for thousands of years. The fourth book, called Real Magic, was then looking at the same thing from the point of view of Western esotericism, because yoga is like Eastern esotericism. So this was now looking at it from the Western, and it suddenly realized or occurred to me that what we would call the cities, and from an Eastern perspective, we call magic in the West. So that was the connection. I'm sad to say that up until that time, I don't think I would have ever mentioned the word magic and psychic phenomena in the same breath, because it seems like they're really far apart, but actually they are identical. Then cities, magic, and psychic effects are all exactly the same thing, just shaped by language and culture. So that's why I got into magic, because I realized I've been kind of doing studies on magic without thinking of it in those terms for a very long time. So that was a long-winded answer, but
No, it's
that's the answer.
perfect. I think it's thank you so much for describing it, because I think it elucidates such clarity on just the nature of how it's hidden in plain sight in some ways. You researched three different types of magical practice, mainly, is what I've gathered, and each of them actually has like a scientific counterpart to it as well.
Right. So the three classes I call enchantment, which we would call mind-matter interaction. The second is divination, which would be clairvoyance. And the third is theurgy, which is a mashup of words in Latin and Greek that basically say God work or divine work. And that is referring to the area of survival evidence, things like mediumship. So it's true that each one of these three major classes have some subclasses within them, but all of them have been studied within parapsychology, mostly in laboratory studies. So we
Can
know
I
that all of them have an actual empirical basis to them. All of them are real. What we see in the laboratory is quite weak in terms of the magnitude, unless you're very lucky and you happen to have a very talented person that you're working with. But for most average people, the effects are pretty weak but real.
can you describe some of the more fascinating experiments across each of these different fields that you've experienced, witnessed, come across?
So let's take an example of divination. So one form of divination is precognition, and there's several different classes there. There's conscious precognition, which is somewhat rare. There's also unconscious precognition, which occurs in dreams, and it occurs as a result that you can feel something in your body that is giving you a clue about something that is about to unfold. So the typical example there is that you've driven to work a million times and using the same road, and you know that there's a certain place where you're driving where you have a stoplight, traffic light. And so you're approaching the traffic light this day, and you get a feeling, a bad feeling about that particular traffic light. Maybe you even get that early in the morning. You start thinking about it and thinking there's something wrong with that. So you're approaching it, and the light is green, and so you would normally start speeding up a little bit to make sure you get through the intersection. But today something is wrong. So you start slowing down. And the closer and closer you get to the green light, the more you slow down, which is confusing people behind you because they don't know what's going on. And so when you actually approach the intersection, you're almost stopped at that point. And suddenly, out of apparently nowhere, a truck barrels through their red light and through the intersection and would have hit you broadside if you had not been slowing down. So I call this a presentiment because it's not precognizing, it's not knowing what's about to happen, it's feeling it somehow. You just have a feeling something's not right. So there are many, many variations on this story. So one that gave me an idea of how to do an experiment was that I was working with a colleague who liked to go hunting. So on the weekend, like he was preparing the next weekend to go hunting, with his buddies, and they have rifles and they have pistols. And he has a six-shot double-action revolver that he takes. So he's cleaning the whole thing. He takes all the bullets out, and he cleans it all up. And now he's putting the bullets back into the cylinders. Even though it's a six-shot revolver, only puts 5 bullets in there, so the hammer will be over the empty chamber. So he's putting in the bullets, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he picks up the fifth bullet, and he gets that bad feeling. Something about that bullet is not right. So he sets it aside. So now you have two empty chambers. You have the hammer over 6, and you have the empty one over 5. a double action revolver, you pull it and it pulls the hammer back, it rotates the cylinder, and then it hits on the next chamber, which is empty now. So they all go hunting and with his friends, and then they come back after a day of hunting and they do what you should not do if you have a bunch of guns around. They start drinking. So a fight breaks out between two of his buddies, and he sees that one of them picks up his revolver and is pointing it directly in the face of another guy that he's been arguing with, and he's pulling the trigger. Well, you can see what's about to happen here. This is not good. So he intervenes. He steps between the two, but too late. The hammer had been all the way pulled back and went, rather than bang, shooting him in the face, click into the fifth chamber, which is the bullet that he had taken out. So he said he felt at that moment that something about that moment of horror, because he didn't even remember that he took the bullet out, it saved his life. Because if that bullet was in there, it would have killed him.
Phew.
So, so how do we simulate this in a laboratory without putting people in actual danger? We sit somebody down in front of a computer. We wire them up to look at their heart rate and their skin conductance and other unconscious physiological measures. And then they press a button and the screen is blank for 5 seconds. And then a picture comes up to the very emotional or very calm. And then that stays for 3 seconds, and then it goes away for 30 seconds, and then they get a chance to do this again. They might do 30 or 40 of these trials. Each time the picture is selected from a large pool of pictures that may be calm or emotional. And more importantly, the selection process is done after that 5 second waiting period. So there's no picture yet. It's selected by using a true random process right before it's shown. So it really is in the future at that point. And the hypothesis is that if there's some element of your unconscious that can feel what is about to happen, well, maybe your heart rate would speed up, or maybe your skin conductance would change because you're sweating a little bit more. So we did that experiment and it worked amazingly well. We used like really calm pictures, really emotional pictures, but it worked really, really well. So my colleagues started to replicate it, and as that was now about 20 years ago, so we have something like 4 dozen replications of this experiment from multiple labs around the world, and it's very clear that this is a real effect, which kind of makes sense. I mean, all of our experiments are based on what people report in the real world, not just once, but oftentimes many times. So we can see this now in the laboratory, and we can exclude all of the mundane explanations, like maybe it was peripheral vision or you heard something, or all of those things can be excluded. So this is an example then of how we know that that aspect of divination, this is in a case of your body telling you something, which is why you should pay attention to gut feelings. You know, something funny in your viscera or in your heartbeat. If you can feel that, take that as a clue. It's telling you something. So that's an example of an experiment in divination. And there are many others as well. I mean, there in each one of these classes, there's probably a half a dozen different experiments, which are useful because you can then say, well, if it's true, say in my unconscious, is it also true in my conscious when I'm conscious, like I'm making decisions? Well, it turns out yes. Is it also true in brain activity? Yes. You know, you can go through this sequence and continually get confirmations by looking at the same phenomena in different ways. And that gives you more and more confidence that it's a real thing. And so, again, I just mentioned one experiment because it has a dramatic story associated with it, but it could have settled a whole bunch of others.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also, it's. I think everyone can relate to those few moments where we have where we kind of just that gut feeling where something's kind of off and you just don't know why, and then later down the track it kind of turns into like, ah, that's why that happened. Like your mate's story, especially with the gun, is kind of is quite the harrowing one.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to just double click on for just a sec there is you talk about precognition, but then you use the word presentiment. And I couldn't help but notice that yeah, because cognition sounds very in the mind, but sentiment feels more like a felt sense. And I think it's interesting because when I lean into even like I do some work with I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Dr. Jose Silva, and his work towards leading people through developing like an intuitive sense and stuff like that. And
Sure.
one of his trainings is very like developing the visual acumen for one person to be able to visualize. And it never really worked that well for me, but I could really have a felt sense in my body of what I was trying to visualize. And so I just sort of
Mhm.
started running with that. But I think everybody has I don't know, I'd love to get your thoughts having researched this. Do you think different people have different, like, dominant, almost internal senses? Does that make sense, the question that I'm asking?
Oh, yeah. No, people are different. It's the rule number one when you're learning about psychology. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap and similarities, which is why we're able to talk to each other and sort of know what's going on with somebody else. But people are fundamentally different. We have different talents and different predilections, different personalities, different bodies, different genetics. Fortunately, they're similar enough that we can get along. But when you get down to brass tacks, especially for something that could be considered a subtle form of perception or subtle form of internal consciousness, there's quite a range of abilities and preferences. So it is not surprising at all that some people could be extremely good at divination and not good at enchantment at all, and vice versa. And there are people who are really, really good at gaining information from what seems to be entities that are no longer living, or not, or maybe were never human. So that's I'm talking here about the third category of theurgy. So in my case, for example, I have never encountered anything that I would consider to be a spirit or even any form of survival evidence. But I have friends who do, like mediums, who see dead people constantly everywhere, which I think would be disturbing, but somehow they deal with it. Um, so yeah, so I'm not surprised that people will have different talents and different abilities with these kinds of not really exceptional abilities, because everyone has something. Everyone has some kind of skill, whether they know it or not, in this domain. And I think that it is not only humans that have these abilities, but it's any form of sentience. So probably all the way down to bacteria. They're what we think of as consciousness in plants or in animals and so on. Would probably be quite different than what we think of as our self-awareness, but they have some kind of awareness. And I think then that the experiences that we're talking about, whether it's in terms of magic or psychic, it's simply part of the fabric of reality. It's not something that is anointed upon somebody. The talent might be, but the phenomenon itself is suggesting that there's some form of deep interconnectedness among all things. That's simply part of the fabric of reality, and that it transcends what we think of as space and time. So when I say deep interconnectedness, I'm talking about transcending space and time, because that's the essence of psychic and mystical experience, and it also plays an important role within magical practice.
Woo! Inspired soul. This conversation with Dean is so interesting about magic and the place in the world, and we're going to dive even deeper about how you can start to wield some really cool, practical ways to weave some of this stuff into your own life. Just before we get there, I want to take a quick moment to thank all of you that are subscribed to the channel. We've recently hit 100,000 subscribers. Thank you so much for your incredible love and support. Everything you see around here is powered and empowered by your subscription to the channel. Now, to all of you that are watching a second, third, fourth video, man, thank you so much. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do take a moment. The bell notification icon, the subscribe button, it's just below. So hit the subscribe button, hit that bell notification icon. And it just, it helps so much with everything we're doing, championing love, positivity, and wisdom around the world. Thank you so much in advance for your blessings. Without too much further ado, back to Dean. It's really interesting because you've been in this space for, well, over 30 years, over almost 40. You've probably watched people's receptivity to, well, I'm sure now we're having conversations like this, podcasts like this. Consciousness is a common conversation, or becoming more and more common, I should say. But when rewinding back 30 years ago, I'm imagining it probably wasn't as open a conversation as we're having here as on today's podcast. Um, have you noticed Yeah, have you noticed a shift in consciousness that's been going on? Um, to put it a bit broad brush as a conversation, but then also, is that making more and more of these abilities come online for people? Because just like we discussed, I think the reason I asked the question previously was to just I think some people might be switched like turned off because they're expecting it a certain to look and behave a certain ways as because they see the stereotypical kind of Hollywood, like, oh yeah, I saw something and precognized it. And yet, it might not be show up that way specifically for them. And as you're watching consciousness evolve, are more and more extrasensory abilities coming online, in your opinion? Is there a correlation between the two?
I believe there is, yes. It is partially that as you were mentioning, that 30 years ago, there were very few conferences on consciousness of any type. There were philosophers interested in consciousness. There always have been, the mind body issue. Uh, but most scientists would have had no interest in consciousness at all, with the one exception being anesthesiologists, because their job is to turn it off. Other than that, neuroscientists had no interest, psychologists had no interest, and in the other more hard disciplines, so-called hard disciplines, they had no interest at all. Like it wasn't even part of the discipline, and so they'd never even think about it. And even among the lay public, the idea that there was something that could be studied was also quite foreign. I remember talking to an uncle many, many years ago and saying that I was about to go to Princeton University to study consciousness. And it took him a while to figure out what it meant. Like, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a scientist. So I said, well, what do you mean that you're studying consciousness? What does it even mean? Well, I had to actually struggle at the time to figure out how to describe to him that this was actually a thing. Like the fact that we're aware is a very deep mystery. It's still not solved. We don't know how that is. So, so this is really dramatically changed in the last 30 years. So now it's like every single month there's at least one conference that is focused on consciousness on some aspect of one or the other. That it's almost overwhelming now because people will say, "Oh, are you going to this science and consciousness conference?" And then my own response to that was, "Well, what are you talking about? Which one?" I mean, literally everywhere.
I just got back from
And
it.
well, I mean, now that most of the time they're also online, so I'm like at the end of the month, I'm in one, and actually it's coming up soon. I can't even keep them straight. So
Case in
there's
point.
one on Buddhism and consciousness, which I've been invited to, and there's ones on science and consciousness. It's just like overwhelming now. Suddenly, the uh, the drawbridge has been raised and the water is coming through or something. There's a big change. So, how does that affect the actual phenomena that people have? I think the experiences are probably the same as they've always been. The difference is that people are more willing to talk about it. So the taboo that has prevented people from taking it seriously, at least in public, like taboos are all about public versus private. So in public now, it is becoming more and more acceptable, not only for lay people, but for scientists to talk about this. I mean, these are big science conferences now talking about the nature of consciousness. And that has also changed the nature of the discussion because when a person goes through a scientific career, this is still pretty much the case, but it is changing. You go through a scientific career, you are never taught or never even mentioned to you that science is based on a set of assumptions. And so the assumptions that we're not taught that is actually philosophy is that we live in a world made of matter and energy. That's the assumption. It's materialism. That's what a philosopher would call it. So if we live in a worldview that assumes that everything is made out of matter and energy, that allows certain things to exist and other things not to exist. And the key is that consciousness is very, very difficult to account for if you imagine that everything is material, because material is like looking at the world from the outside, and consciousness is somehow looking at it from the inside. So to clarify, the so-called hard problem in consciousness is that we have experiences. So you can watch somebody from the outside take a bite out of a lemon, and we can actually trace it now all the way down to the individual neurons and the way the brain is working and all of the rest of it. But that doesn't tell us anything about what it's like to bite into a lemon, the experience of it. So this is what's called qualia, is this internal sense of what it's like to have an experience. And the phrase is like what it's like to have the experience. Well, we don't know how to account for that from pure material. So we know a lot about the way the brain works. We know that there are correlates between internal experience and the brain activity and all of that. But now we're finding that thought leaders in physics and the neurosciences and psychology are beginning to recognize that maybe one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to understand this is because we're asking the wrong question. A philosopher would say it's a category mistake. You're assuming something which is a mistake, like asking what is the square root of an orange? Well, that question doesn't make any sense. It's like that's why it's a category mistake. So if somebody said, well, what is the brain activity that's giving rise to consciousness? That's like the square root of an orange. It doesn't make any sense. So this is why you're finding more and more scientists who are saying, well, maybe we were asking the wrong question. Maybe it's not that consciousness arises out of the brain. Maybe the brain arises out of consciousness or something else. And so this is what philosophers have been talking about forever. And it says, well, where maybe some of our assumptions that science has been based on are not correct. And by the way, anytime you have a set of assumptions, not all of them are 100% correct. Some of them are going to be wrong. Some are probably slightly wrong. Some are really wrong. So I think what's happening now is we're seeing that some of the assumptions that has driven science to this point are simply wrong, not to a minor degree, but to a huge degree. So the pushback from that I hear often, not so much anymore, but I used to hear it a lot, is that can't possibly be right, because otherwise we have to throw away all of our textbooks and start over again. That's a fear. And so I said, no, you've misunderstood. It's not that materialism as a doctrine is wrong. It's a special case. It is extremely effective for certain kinds of things in the world. Just like classical mechanics is really, really good, except in the space of large gravity and large spaces and so on. Then you need relativity, or in the space of the extremely small where you need quantum mechanics. So we're not throwing away classical physics. It works, got us to the moon and back. It's just not good enough. So materialism as a doctrine is not good enough to be the kind of comprehensive way of understanding reality that is necessary for us to begin to understand consciousness. And now here's the rub. The rub is the moment you step away from materialism and you entertain more broader ways of understanding reality, suddenly consciousness is included, and psychic, mystical, and magical experiences are also included. Because if consciousness actually is a key component of the way that reality works, then psychic phenomena would work because it's going to be primary before physics, and magical phenomena for the same reason, and mystical experience, which is the perception of all there is. So that's why I think the curve that we're on, if we look at this in terms of the increase in various forms of consciousness in science and outside of science, we're on an exponential rise, and we're beyond the knee of the curve at this point. That means that the exponential part is going almost straight up, and we're in the midst of that right now. And so one of the reasons why I was motivated to write another book after Real Magic is because I wrote Real Magic 5 years ago. This is 2024 that I'm speaking. So I wrote that 5 years ago, and from then just till now, from 5 years, huge changes in how these topics are being addressed. That means you really are on an almost completely vertical rise in terms of interest. And I figured, well, I better write about this now, because if we wait another 5 years, it's hard to predict where we're going to be.
Hi there, guys. I wanted to take a quick moment just to introduce you to my one-to-one coaching. It's something that I deeply love doing. As you can tell, conscious conversation is such a massive part of my life. And having one-to-one, deep, meaningful conversations with people where I get to show up as your brother or as the coach or as your mentor has been such a gift for me personally, and a gift for lots of the people that I have supported on the journey of living a more spiritually empowered, spiritually powered, spiritually aligned life. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's some examples of people all around the world that have experienced profound transformations through this coaching experience.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines. And
he's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing, and Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him, and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amrit.coach/life. And guys, if I can say so myself, I do think this is something quite special. Most people that I see building things online don't really work with people this deeply, this intimately, one-on-one as things start to grow, just because it is so time intensive. And yet I'm so deeply passionate about the transformation that comes from one-to-one coaching that just isn't available anywhere else. It would be my absolute honor and a pleasure to support your spiritual awakening, your spiritual path, your spiritual unfoldment. It is my life's work. I look forward to seeing you in the call. Back to today's podcast. It's super inspiring, and that's probably a question worth asking in terms of where you do think we're going to be 5 years from now. But just before we get there was something, well, what you've just alluded to, it's unpacking something really deep in my mind, because so much of science, the way I view science background of an engineer is, you've got maths builds, and which is built upon, then physics builds upon that, and then you've got chemistry building upon your physics, then you've got biology building upon your chem. But then you underpinned maths is measuring matter. And I was like, oh, yeah, matter. Oh, materialism. Oh, that's a philosophy and a school of thought that mainstream science is built upon. And so I can see the ladder and hierarchy. That was very clarifying for me. And you said consciousness is primary. Can you just clarify what the ladder would look like on how these different fields build upon each other over here? Is that possible, or is it not as clear as a ladder?
Yeah. It's the pyramid of knowledge, is the way we think of it from a disciplinary perspective, is the bottom slice of that pyramid is physics. You could add mathematics in there too, but it's physics, the discipline of physics, and then chemistry, and then biology, and then psychology, and so on. So the pyramid is building up to, at the very top of that pyramid is the assumption that somehow consciousness emerges out of all of this somehow. So that's materialism. And materialism really doesn't quite know where consciousness should go in this pyramid. It sticks it at the top because we don't know where else to put it. Yeah. So the only change that happens is that we take consciousness and we put it below physics. It's a new slice below physics. And now the question is, well, how do you get the physical world emerging out of something as kind of non-physical, abstract as consciousness? Well, that's what philosophers have been discussing for thousands of years. It's the philosophical ideas like idealism and dual aspect monism and panpsychism, and there's a whole bunch of words like that. And these have been pretty well developed. And more importantly, major neuroscientists and physicists and others, as I've mentioned, are now using those words, right? Because they recognize we need something more comprehensive. Well, what do we do with it? Well, it's like they suddenly discovered that there's philosophy of science. And so this issue would have been solved many, many years ago if every scientist was taught, oh, by the way, there's a philosophy of science. We were being taught a certain worldview. There are other worldviews They're not going to discount what you're doing, but it's more comprehensive ways of thinking about the nature of reality with a big R. There is something more because most of us have lived in the developed countries, at least, within a certain set of philosophical assumptions, which assumes that materialism is the way things are. Assume like materialism equals reality with a big R. This is not the case. Reality is much, much bigger than simply materialism. It's something more. And we're kind of forced to face that through what we're seeing as a renaissance almost, or a resurgence of interest in the nature of consciousness and its role in the physical world. It's in there somehow.
Just to take a sort of sideways step, this has been suppressed for because this is now we're having more and more conversations like this, but witches were burned at the stake. Magic doesn't have a very positive reception if you look back through history. But then also reading your book was quite interesting because there are people, well, you look at something like certain churches and certain institutions, some people are allowed to do magic and the rest are forbidden from it. Can you shine a light on some of the more interesting parts of history and why magic, in your opinion, has been suppressed?
Yeah. So sociologists of history will call it the disenchantment of the world. And we are currently in the re-enchantment of the world. So the disenchantment happened, at least a case can be made, and I think this is probably true, that the Orthodox churches have always believed in supernaturalism, which you can say is almost equivalent to divine concepts. And within religion, there's the concept of something bigger than us, God, or some other name like that, which requires the divine because it's invisible, it's omnipotent, it has has all of these qualities of superheroes essentially. And so churches were very powerful because if you go back far enough in time, nobody really understood how anything worked. And so life is uncertain, and people would say, well, there must be a reason why this person got sick or why that entire town got wiped out by some disease that they didn't even know what it was. So religion naturally would arise when people don't have another explanation for something, and because of the uncertainty of life and death. And so as the Catholic Church in particular became more and more powerful, it found that its ability to control, and you see this again and again, any kind of large organizational thing, especially one that has some control over people, that its ability to control them, it depends on their assuming that you actually are in touch with God, right? You are in touch with the divine. You have a direct connection somehow to the divine. So if somebody comes along and starts demonstrating something which we might call magic, like a witch doctor or a seer or somebody they can start attracting people away from the power of the church. That's why witch burning began, because they were threats. And the other reason is that the so-called pagans and heretics who are not within the church at the time were also seen as threats, especially at the time, think of the Druids up in the Celtic world. Well, they were a very magical society and they had their own beliefs. Well, that's not good. That's taboo. That's taking away our power. And so the Inquisition was created and witch burning and all of that. Around the same time, or going back now about 500 years, around the same time was the beginning of what we would think of as science. But the fledgling scientists of the day had to be very, very careful because they saw that their own people were getting burnt at the stake, like Bruno and others, because they were challenging the doctrine that the church said this is the way things are. You weren't allowed to challenge it. So one of the characters here that's important then in this history is Galileo, because Galileo, like others, were very well aware that the church said anything having to do with the human spirit is in our domain. You may not, at the threat of death, question it. So Galileo made a strategic decision, essentially, in an article he wrote, a famous article called The Assayer. in which he said this new science that we're developing, which is based on empiricism, where we test things and then we get some kind of result, and that we use mathematics to describe it. This is only about the objective world. It's about things that we can measure objectively. And it has nothing to do with what he called secondary properties, which had to do with the mind, with consciousness, with spirit, with religious ideas, and so on. He made that separation very clear. That allowed science to progress. And he got away with it. The church said, okay, you could have that, but we still have anything to do with the spirit. So you now have pressure from the church, going back hundreds of years, saying this is our domain. Anything having to do with magic is okay within the church, but it is not okay outside. It is demonic outside. And it's specified in the catechism. That is the way things are. Among science, scientists said the only thing science can do is look at the objective world. It has nothing to do with anything else. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that even as early as maybe 100 years ago, that within psychology, which is the study of the mind, the notion that consciousness existed was taboo. There is no consciousness. This is why people like behaviorism became very popular in psychology, that the only thing that you can say about psychology is observe behavior. Because that's a straight line all the way back to Galileo, saying if we want to do this as science, we could only look at observed behavior and have nothing to do with what's going on the inside. That's what psychology was. So you have pressure from science, don't look at that. You have pressure from the church, don't look at that. And the effect, especially on the academic world, was really, really powerful. And you see it echoed all the way down to the present day. That if you're an academic and you want to get tenure, you don't talk about these things in public because you won't get tenure and you'll be pushed out of the system. And this has been going on for many, many generations. And so the only thing that a student will hear in most universities is these things like psychic stuff and magical stuff. It's really, really interesting from a psychological perspective. Why do people believe in that stuff? But it's certainly not real. Like there are a lot of other explanations, psychological deficits and so on, but it's not real. This is still the prevailing opinion. It's going to change. It is already changing because, as I said, consciousness is pushing it hard. And anyway, the data is already there. There's tons of data saying that, no, these psychic effects really are real. And some of the magical effects are real too, because they're kind of the same thing. So that will change, but it'll change a lot quicker if during a scientific career, students are taught that you're working within a set of assumptions. And some of them are wrong. And the ones that we think are wrong have to do with consciousness. That completely changes the nature of the game. It will also change the taboo. And as I said, there are now a growing number of historians and religious scholars and sociologists who are saying, we are in the midst of a re-enchantment of the world. And so one of the reasons why this is so important, something feels like it's left out. Well, what is it? One way to answer that is that the scientific worldview is a worldview of nihilism. That's a philosophy that nothing matters. There is literally no meaning or purpose to anything. Where does that come about? It comes about because of the nature of materialism. All there is material. You're a hunk of material. When you die, that's the end of the story. There's nothing left because there is no you. And there's no purpose, right? It's all just matter. It's hunks of matter that somehow randomly everything happens. So our internal sense says that can't possibly be the case. Like humans, we eat meaning. We need meaning in the same way that we eat food. You can't exist without some purpose and meaning. So you step back and you say, I'm now an academic psychologist. I would say, well, that's just like that's a problem. It's a frailty of what it means to be human. This new version of reality that we're beginning to see develop now is saying that's probably not the case. It looks like meaning is somehow also inherently wrapped into reality. It may not be meaning in the same sense as I have a need for something, so I'm going to attribute meaning to it. Maybe more abstract than that. But nevertheless, it is as though mind and matter and meaning are threads that weave together in a way that create a tapestry that is reality with the capital R. So that's how that's one of the reasons why I think people feel that something is missing, because it actually is. And it was a matter of a mistake in the philosophy that at least Western civilization had adopted.
When you look back, do you think there's been like, is there something that you've got a bit of nostalgia for that you think that might have been like, is there a nostalgia for what may have been lost through the ages of having suppressed these studies and burning witches at the stake and such things, and relegating magic into the hands of a select few? Because if this had been, I don't want to use the word enshrined, but let's just use the word enshrined for a second. Enshrined as science has been enshrined thus far, or materialist science has been enshrined thus far. The amount of development and the sort of studies in the space would have filled out the colors between the lines in such a richer degree to somewhat. Is there some sort of how do you feel about that?
That's the real question. That's the key question. Like, why did we develop in this direction, as opposed to something almost like a utopia where everybody gets along and everybody is fine and has very strong abilities of this type? And there certainly are legends like that, right? We have folklore legends of Lemuria and Atlantis and things like that, where everybody was young and beautiful and had probably were perfectly fine people, and yet they went away. Well, I don't know if those stories are true or not. I mean, there's increasing evidence that even our ideas about how long some kind of civilization has been around, those are probably way too conservative. That maybe we've had multiple very advanced civilizations for a very long time, maybe. So what happened then? Well, one of the things that happened is that we're, besides having some awareness and consciousness and so on, we're social animals and we're highly aggressive. We're primates. We are very clever, very aggressive primates. That is probably why we have survived, because we're being part of the aggression, part of the cleverness means we're resilient. And so if the weather changes, the climate changes, things happen, asteroid hits the Earth, who knows? Only things that are very resilient are going to survive. It's like us and cockroaches, and that's it. Because the dinosaurs were wiped out, but we're still here. So you then look at what else does an organism need? It needs to be able to survive. And so we put a very high premium on maintaining both the resilience and the aggression, and even a pretty broad range of what it's like to be human. So we have some humans who are autistic, some that are psychotic. I mean, there's the range probably is not a mistake. You have people who are on the edge of madness, who are also the ones who are known for being highly creative, right? Like in the arts. We have people who are autistic who maybe have abilities that so-called neurotypical people don't have. We call it lightning calculation and having memories that are like perfect memories of everything. Well, a quote normal person can't do that. We don't have that ability, but they do. Well, in some respect, that's pretty good, because until we had computers, you needed somebody to remember everything. And so they would do it. And likewise, in more indigenous cultures, you'd have shaman, who were the psychics. They're the magicians. They were able to do things. But those people, when they're really, really good, usually can't take care of themselves very well, right? They're not going to have an ordinary job. They can't do that stuff. They needed the community to take care of them because they're valuable. Well, we don't have those jobs anymore. I mean, where do you look up a job saying, I want a job as a shaman? Maybe in California, here and there, you could find a job like that. But in most places now, you don't find jobs for a shaman, even though it's probably an essential component of the world. So take all of that and kind of spin it together, and you find that the aggression is probably what's eating us alive. It's a combination of aggression and also the recognition that we need to eat food, we need to have resources, we need certain things in order for us to exist as organisms. That naturally leads into a direction where we find governments eventually arising that are pushing us away, that are distracting us from what it would be like to be more open about these things. But there's another reason. The other reason is, let's say that you get an entire civilization that is aware of and actually uses their psychic ability. About the closest I can think of is maybe ancient Greece, when they had the mystery schools. So the mystery schools were important because they were open to everyone, including at the time slaves, and it probably involved psychedelics. And the reason why it involved psychedelics was to give people a sense of what reality actually is like. It gave them a mystical experience. So everyone had that experience. When you have that experience, it opens you up to all kinds of things that otherwise you may not be aware of. Well, one of the things that may happen is that people become more telepathic, whether it's literally being able to not read somebody's mind, but get a sense of who they are in a more intimate way, rather than simply having to rely on what they say. So imagine an entire civilization where people can tell if you're lying. Just something as simple as that. Like they have a really, really good internal sense. This person is lying now, and everybody knows it. Okay, what does that do for the justice system and politics and business and law and all of it? It would be so different from the world that we live in today, that besides science and besides religion, you have politics pushing very, very hard against the idea that we want people to be that open, because we can't maintain civilization as it currently is if everybody knows who's lying. And so you can make a case then that the disenchantment came about as a result of a variety of different kinds of pressures, some of which are still pretty active. Like people who are in positions of great power today, whether it's money or politics, they absolutely don't want people to know what's actually going on with them, because like they don't want telepaths around knowing what's going on. They will suppress it one way or the other. An easy way to suppress our knowledge about this is simply say there's no federal funding for this. You know, you can do whatever you want. You know, you use pieces of gum and string to do your experiments because we'll give you $1 a day, but you're not going to get more than that. Well, that essentially puts a stopper on the speed with which we can learn anything. And so it has taken about 140 years for science that has been systematically looking at these kinds of effects to gain extremely high confidence that the effects are real. But if we had $1 billion a year, we would have learned that a century ago. So, I mean, that is one of the consequences of this kind of suppression. So in short, what has been lost is that we would be centuries ahead of where we currently are today, and the nature of civilization would look very, very different.
Hey there, quick questions. What is your relationship with magic in your life? Is it something that's already well established? Did you know that you had it, or are you just finding out that actually some of the stuff you were doing was magic? Or is this something that you're about to bring into your life? I'd love to hear from you about your relationship with magic in the comments below. Leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And if there are any questions that you have for Dean, I'm sure he'll be back on again in the future. Leave some questions below. And if you want me to ask them next time around, I'd be honored to do so on your behalf. With that, back to Dean in today's episode. It's interesting because it feels like as much as they try to, I'm picturing like a beach ball that they're trying to keep under the water somewhat. But it keeps wanting to pop its head back up. And what I mean by that is I look at something like, well, even Dr. Joe Dispenza's work with the placebo, and just how much, you know, he wrote the book like You Are the Placebo, and just how much it's so hard to keep like, oh yeah, we're the placebo, you know, like it's so hard to, where did like your mind and your relationship with matter, and you can only suppress so much without it rearing its head in all sorts of nooks and crannies, almost like roses growing out of concretes.
Yeah, the way it appears and it has always appeared as entertainment, right? How many movies and superhero movies and horror movies and novels are based on the idea that people have these special powers. It's a very large chunk of the entertainment business, and it's perfectly fine there. We know those kinds of movies and stories would not be as prevalent as they are without people resonating with them. Because if you have a story that is so bizarre that people don't even know how to react to it, that kind of story is not going to be around for very long. But they are. And so, I mean, it's also not a mistake. It's not an accident that in science fiction stories like either Star Wars or Star Trek, you had characters who were able to do this. And Star Trek did it in a brilliant way, where Mr. Spock, the most rational creature among the crew, through meditation, learned how to do mind melds. Well, that's perfect, right? It means that at a more highly advanced state of internal understanding, which is an important part of the Vulcan thing. Yeah, these are quite real abilities, and it's not even a big deal. But yeah, so you see this in science fiction again and again.
It's also, I wanted to zoom back out for a quick sec, because something I picked up through researching your work was, let's see if I can frame this question up the way I'm trying to intend to, is that whilst magical abilities are suppressed, there's almost like a insidious thing that's happening, is that the collective belief in the abilities is dimmed, and therefore the current with which people that are enchanted, let's use that as a term, can wield their access to said abilities is actually more challenged as well. And yet, if there's more of a collective belief, the current universally gets stronger for people to be able to access these abilities, and therefore it becomes easier to wield said abilities. I think I got it out right. Can you explain that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is true that personal belief and collective belief are aspects that will modulate the ability for these effects to be stronger or less strong. To a degree. So we know certainly within individuals that belief is a very important factor, and certainly in magical practice. If you're doing a magical spell or some kind of enchantment, and internally while you're doing whatever the ritual might be, you're thinking, this is stupid, this is bullshit, this can't work, then it's not going to work. So belief is known to be a very, very important modulator of this. The question now that you're asking is, well, what about if the society doesn't believe it? Does that have a factor? The answer is yes, because among other things, it means that if you tell somebody that you're doing magical acts and the response that you're getting back are looks of disbelief or looks of skepticism and so on, that affects your own ability to believe. You start thinking, ew, maybe I was wrong. Maybe that will stop the ability. It'll squash it. So doubt is definitely one of the factors that magicians will try to avoid. And one of the ways of avoiding it is you don't tell anybody. So in the sorcery traditions, a sorcerer would never reveal what they're doing to anybody, even to other sorcerers, because they first of all don't want other people's intentions intermixing with whatever they're doing. And second, they don't want the slightest amount of doubt to creep in. This is very difficult now in the modern age because most of us have gone through more or less standardized education where we're told that this stuff is fine for education, but that's it. In which case, if you're interested in magic and you dabble with it, you do read books and try things, it's very difficult to suspend your disbelief because you're like just on the edge of thinking, well, maybe this is stupid. I shouldn't be doing it. Or maybe from a religious sense, I'm thinking like this is going to open the door to some sort of demonic who knows what, and that I shouldn't do it. So those kinds of doubts very easily creep in, and they will block it. They'll block the effect. So people then say, "Well, I'd like to use magic on something." Well, what do I do? You suspend your disbelief. You have to imagine the same sense that you go to when you see a superhero movie. If you go to that movie and you're thinking, this is stupid. Nobody can do this, what the superhero people are doing. Well, why bother go to the movie? You go to the movie and you suspend your disbelief. And so you do the same thing when you're involved, when you're doing some kind of a magical act. You suspend it as best as you can so there is complete belief, no doubt at all, during the act itself, whatever that happens to be. And then later you can start doubting yourself, but at least during the effort, during the intentional effort, there is no doubt at all. And it takes a while to learn how to do that, but that's what's necessary.
I think the doubt and the skepticism is really interesting, isn't it? Because we're inclined to be skepticism is viewed as like a healthy thing, but then also it's just masquerading. It's just doubt masquerading around.
Well, but it is important, right? Because the downside of all this is that you can start seeing omens in everything. Right. Everything then starts to look like, then now there are people psychically attacking me and there are magicians after me, and you can get paranoid. You can get pulled into a bad place pretty quickly.
Mm.
As one of the magicians, I've read a lot of books on magic, and one of them says that he started doing magical practices and was with his friends, and he would watch his friends, and some of them would go barking mad. Right? You get pulled into a place like a rabbit hole, and you just end up going completely psychotic. You go crazy because for two things. One is that you start to see that some of the stuff is real, like the magic is real. That already is kind of a freak out. The second thing is that you allow it to take over everything else. And so magic can be quite real, but that doesn't mean that you need to stop working with whatever your work is, and you need to stop all of your relationships with other people and everything else. You can have everything is exactly the same as the way it was before with one new thing. Well, okay, the one new thing is pretty strange, but it's just one new thing. It's not like the rest of everything. So it's useful to be reminded of that again and again so that people don't end up going barking mad.
Interesting balance there between how to navigate doubt and skepticism. I'm looking forward to asking you, where does one begin if they are interested in beginning? But I think the key thing I wanted to ask before that is some of the stuff we're discussing now, because I think there probably are other like grounded practical reasons why it's not always been available as a modality for everyone to approach and wield. Are there some pre-qualifiers before I ask a question such as, hey, how do people get started? Is there any asterisks and caveats we need to put in place?
Many caveats. So it is known by meditation teachers that roughly 2% of people learning how to meditate will become psychotic. So there's danger in anything, right? So especially when we're dealing with getting a better sense of who and what you are and what you might be capable of. So if something as simple and gentle as meditation can make some people become psychotic, you can imagine what happens when your worldview is shattered because you now have the door has been opened a little bit and you can now see that there's a lot more out there. This is another reason why psychedelics are so dangerous. That for as a party drug, it's one thing. For some people will take psychedelics more than 2%, and they will go quite crazy. They'll become crazy. Well, anytime you're addressing your ability to understand the nature of reality and your role in it, for some people that is both frightening and destabilizing, and it's psychologically not healthy. So how do you tell in advance whether you're one of those people? Very, very difficult. So experienced meditation teachers will sometimes do an interview with somebody to find out, like, how grounded are you really? How easy do you freak out? When you do freak out, well, what's your go-to way of solving your sense of freak out? So if your go-to way is drinking a huge amount of alcohol, maybe you should do something else. Go play soccer or something. Go do something different because this is not for you. And there's lots of other ways. I mean, a really good psychologist, a clinical psychologist, will recognize that this is probably not a good thing for you. the more grounded, the better. And especially the more grounded and having social outputs to be able to discuss with somebody, like, am I going crazy? And if your friends that you trust saying, yeah, like, back off, dude, something's not right here, well, then, yeah, you need to pay attention to that. But in terms of what would you do then, knowing that there are some caveats here, that you don't gain power without having something challenging yourself. There are lots and lots of books. There's lots and lots of YouTubes, lots of videos, and so on. There's lots of ways that you could find out pretty quickly. There's even some reasonably good online mystery schools to help you do this. The best in every single case is to find at least one trusted teacher with a good reputation that can guide you through it. Same is true in meditation. Same is true in any kind of thing where you're trying to learn something. You find somebody who's been there before and knows what to do and what to avoid. So there are teachers around too. So as with any kind of teacher, you go by word of mouth, by recommendations of this person was really good and stay away from that person, those kinds of things. For a very, very elementary introduction, primarily for scientists or people who trust science, that's what I wrote Real Magic for, about as a book. But mainly this is the next book that I have coming out, because in that book, I go through the science and the evidence, whatever. But then like the last third of the book is, well, what do I do? What are the practical things that you need to keep in mind, and what are the practices? So the easiest practice that kind of attracts people now because it's simple is sigil magic. A sigil is a symbol. You take a word or a sentence that says what your desire is. This is for enchantment type magic. And you use that to craft it into a symbol. And then there are ways of focusing on the symbol to empower it, so to speak. And then you release it into the world and your sigil is done. And then you allow the universe to go ahead and do whatever that enchantment was. But there are lots of other methods. And so in the process of putting together a book where I spent time going through these different methods, I found that for me at least, one of the methods that I found the best for me, and I have a couple of quizzes in the book that say, well, what should I do? Well, it depends on what you're good at. So one thing I found that was really good for me was knot magic, which is not N-O-T, but K-N-O-T. It's making knots, making little knots. So this is a piece of yarn. You could use a piece of leather or string or whatever. And so the point of enchantment magic is that you're instantiating a desire, an intention. You're taking it out of your mind and putting it out into the world. And so how do you do that? Well, all of the methods are variations of that. How do you take this thing inside your head and cast it into the world? So knot magic is, while you're creating a knot, literally creating a knot in some kind of string or something, as you are pulling the knot closed, you imagine that your intention is in the knot. You're pulling it, you're capturing it into the knot. And what I like about it is that it's kinesthetic, right? It's not like a purely mental thing that's going on. It's not even symbolic. You're capturing it inside that little knot. And so you can do it again and again and again and again. So this was one string, but I made, 50, 60 knots to turn it into a little object. And so there it is. So you've now encapsulated your intention. You've put it out into the world. And then you can set it aside, or you can put it on the wall, or you can destroy it. You can do anything you want with it. The goal is to get it out of your conscious awareness, right? As long as it's in your consciousness, your conscious awareness, you're kind of holding it there. This even is a thing in physics, quantum Zeno effect. The more that you pay attention to something, you kind of freeze it. And so I don't want to freeze it. I want to first create it and then go boom, let it out there. So I keep this one around because I don't exactly sort of remember what it was about, but I also then told myself, don't dwell on it. Sort of let it go out and do what it needs to do without dwelling on it. So if I remember clearly, I can kind of reconstruct what it was that I was doing, but otherwise I just use it as a way of demonstrating what a knot is. It's not magic. So there's many variations like that. And again, some people will be drawn to that because it's kind of fun. Other people will use a candle. Other people will use words. They'll use symbols. They're all essentially the same thing. They're just appealing you will resonate with one of the methods more than the other. And all of it is about getting the issue of want. I want this, whatever that this happens to be, to get it out of your head and to get it into the world, and to allow your unconscious to then help shepherd it into the world, and somehow the world will respond, and it makes it happen. So we have two stories on that. So one story is this. So in talking about, in vernacular, we'll talk about manifestation. It's the same thing as enchantment. You want something. Okay, so I said, well, let's say that I wanted something very, very simple. Like I want to find the equivalent of a $1 bill. Translate into your language. So I want to find a $1 bill just laying there on the ground. Nobody dropped it. It's just there. I want that. Well, that doesn't require very much of the universe to make that happen. Somebody at some point or something happened to put it there. It just doesn't magically appear. But the magic part of now is that I want to be able to find it. So I put that as an enchantment on myself. I want this thing. Well, you think of this from a probabilistic perspective. The probability of being able to find something like that, especially if you're in a parking lot around a store or something, it's actually pretty high. But I've now tuned myself to be able to look for that. Even subconsciously, I'll be looking for it. The likelihood is I'm going to eventually find it. And I know people who've read my previous book on this where they would find a $10 bill. And people have written back to me saying, yeah, they found it. In some cases, they found it hours after doing the sigil for this. And I think it's more a matter of tuning what it is that we want and paying attention to it, even not consciously, for things that are already there. That's how a lot of magic works, taking advantage of things that are there that we're not paying attention to. So I said, well, what about something that inherently is so improbable that it's not likely to happen? So I want a gold-plated Mercedes to show up in my driveway. That's mine. I want my gold-plated Mercedes, real gold, real Mercedes. And yet it hasn't happened yet, even though I'm using that as an example. And I haven't actually done an enchantment to try to get it, but I use that as an example. And then one of my, a person on a podcast was listening to this, and she sent me this. It's a gold-plated Mercedes. It's not exactly what I had in mind. And what she said along with this was, as you know, and I do know, but I didn't say it, that when you do an enchantment, you have to be extremely clear about what it is that you want. Because even though I was using this as an illustration, I did say I wanted it to be an actual car that I could drive. So here I have a little car, and it is a Mercedes, and it has wheels and everything. So then I'm on another podcast, and I'm telling the story, and I'm looking on my desk for where the gold-plated Mercedes is, and I can't find it. So my brother happened to listen to that podcast, and so he sent me another one. So now I have two gold-plated Mercedes, and this one's a sports car. That one's pretty nice. Again, so they like the doors open, the wheels go and everything. It's still, I can't go with it. So again, you have factors then that amplify these effects. You have intention, attention, motivation, belief, and clarity, right? And your ability to imagine that it's even possible, right? This has to do, again, with suspending your disbelief. If you're thinking, this is stupid, this can't happen, even if everything else is in place, the likelihood goes way down. So there's something like 9 different factors like this, all of which have to be as close to optimal as you can possibly get in order to increase the likelihood that the enchantment will work. So I decided I like my car now, and I don't actually, you see, if I got an actual gold-plated Mercedes, a whole bunch of things have to happen out there in the world for that to really happen, because it's going to be extremely expensive. Somebody's going to question, well, how did you get that? Where did you get that? You have to pay insurance on it and all kinds of things. Now, I don't actually want it. So you think now, going back on it, I don't really want that thing, which of course goes into the mix of the enchantment itself and says, no, cancel. He doesn't really want this. So it means your unconscious has to be in alignment as well, which is hard because by definition, you don't exactly know what that is. So it's one of the reasons why big enchantments are really, really difficult, because typically it involves your unconscious and other people. And so the other people will be thinking somebody has a gold-plated somewhere in the world, they have a gold-plated thing. They're thinking, I don't want to get rid of this. Even if they were able to sense that somebody wanted it, they're thinking, oh, no, you don't. And so am I more powerful than they are? Probably not. And so it becomes each stage along the way, especially involving other people. The reason why black magic is considered to be overriding somebody else's free will, you have to take that into account. I want somebody to do this. If you don't have the permission to do it, you're asking for trouble. And by the way, that also goes to somebody who's ill and you're wishing them well. You probably want to get their permission to do that, because you might be overriding their own free will by casting something upon them.
Hi there, guys. I wanted to take a quick moment just to introduce you to my one-to-one coaching. It's something that I deeply love doing. As you can tell, conscious conversation is such a massive part of my life. And having one-to-one, deep, meaningful conversations with people where I get to show up as your brother or as the coach or as your mentor has been such a gift for me personally, and a gift for lots of the people that I have supported on the journey of living a more spiritually empowered, spiritually powered, spiritually aligned life. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's some examples of people all around the world that have experienced profound transformations through this coaching experience.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines. And
He's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing, and Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him, and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amrit.coach/life. And guys, if I can say so myself, I do think this is something quite special. Most people that I see building things online don't really work with people this deeply, this intimately, one-on-one as things start to grow, just because it is so time intensive. And yet I'm so deeply passionate about the transformation that comes from one-to-one coaching that just isn't available anywhere else. It would be my absolute honor and a pleasure to support your spiritual awakening, your spiritual path, your spiritual unfoldment. It is my life's work. I look forward to seeing you in the call. Back to today's podcast. Yeah, it was very interesting because as you started to share, the foundation stone started to look a lot like desire and want, and I'm glad we got to the subconscious there, because also, as you start to speak to spiritual teachers, they talk a lot about oneness and how desire is actually somewhat emanating through you from consciousness. Like if you can get your own personality desires somewhat, because some of those are programmed in by societal wants and they're not actually innate to the individual's, I want to use the word sacred self, but there's probably another way to put that. They're not innate to the soul, let's put it that way. And then try to navigate your way around the desire and try to manifest something through. And yeah, it was cool to sort of hear you say, your subconscious mind actually plays a large part in this as well. In terms of what can be brought forth and what can't be.
There's also a distinction between want and need. So you may or may not get what you want. You're much more likely to get what you need. So the distinction is, you might think that the want and the need are the same, but they're really not. I mean, you need certain things. You need air, you need a place to live, and things like that. Or maybe you don't need a place to live. There's some people who are nomadic and perfectly happy wherever they are. So the want and the need is a distinction that is not always crystal clear, but there's something about the difference between the two. Like I would like to have a suitcase with $1 million. Really? Well, how are you going to actually spend that? There's a very few places in the world where that's going to do you any good at all, because you either have to launder it through a bank, a shady bank somewhere, to be able to use it, since money is all digital now, or you go to Las Vegas or you go someplace else where you can actually use a large amount of cash, because otherwise there are all kinds of agencies watching huge cash transactions because it's probably drug money. And so a suitcase of $1 million is actually not such a good thing to have. So again, it comes down to clarity and thinking about the consequences of what it is that you want/need.
The 9 factors are really interesting as well. I love the ones that you covered: intention, attention, motivation, clarity, belief. One of the easy ones, it's probably all easy, but to some degree. But one of my favorite ones, I guess, is probably inviting people in to bless their food. Right? Like that's such a that's just such an easy access point that I think is already part of the collective zeitgeist. So you don't have to stretch too far to wander into the woods, I guess.
Yeah, especially given foodborne illness. So in the US, we were just going through a case where Big Macs at McDonald's had a very serious and deadly, I think, E. coli problem. So then you're thinking, well, I just wanted a hamburger. I didn't want to kill myself. So part of the blessing of food for a very long time, thousands of years, is that you're about to eat something, and so part of the blessing or the hope is, I hope this doesn't kill me. I'm just trying to get some food here. So we did an experiment to see whether or not the blessing made any difference. And this is also, it's echoing from what I've heard from chefs who occasionally will say that the attitude of the people, especially in a restaurant, if it's a positive attitude, everybody's happy in there, then the customers will respond better than if you have people who are angry or something else, something's going on, sub rosa, and people will not respond as well. So it has an economic aspect to it, to the what is the attitude of the chefs and the emotions. So we did it using chocolate as the food. And so one of the reasons we did that is because whenever you do a clinical trial, you have to recruit people to do it. And we found that it was really easy to recruit people who had to eat chocolate as part of this experiment. We had to beat them away with sticks. So we got this gourmet brand of chocolate that came in little pastilles, like a little coin. And we gave people enough so that 3 middle days of the week, they had to eat the chocolate at 10 a.m. and at 3 p.m. They had to. That's you must do this. We're giving you permission. And at the end of each day during the week, the 7 days, they had to fill out a mood questionnaire, reporting what their mood was like over the course of the day. This is a standardized questionnaire that we use. And so our first version of this, we recruited 60 people, so 30 in each batch. It was double blind and placebo controlled, and that the placebo control was that the people getting the chocolate didn't know what kind of chocolate they had. They knew that somebody would be getting blessed chocolate and some would not be getting blessed chocolate. We had a Mongolian shaman and a Buddhist monk do the blessings. The blessing was that people eating this chocolate would have an elevation in mood. Well, we did that because eating chocolate will elevate your mood in any case. So we're asking for a larger increase of mood elevation in people eating the blessed chocolate. So we did the whole experiment and then looked at the data afterwards. And sure enough, we found that people getting the blessed chocolate had a significantly elevated mood as compared to people getting the same chocolate that had not been blessed. So when I was preparing to publish this thing, I know it was sent out, of course, to referees who are going to look at it and see whether they believe it or not. One of them disbelieved it to such an extent that they hired a separate statistician to look and see whether or not I did the statistics correctly, and I did. And so the paper was ultimately published and showing that something that a Buddhist monk and a Mongolian shaman did changed the way that people responded to this food. And so then a colleague of mine from Taiwan said, we'd like to replicate that study, but we don't eat that much chocolate in Taiwan. So he said, maybe let's use some other kind of thing that people normally would consume, which turned out to be tea, not surprisingly. So we used a large batch of oolong tea, and we separated it into separate bottles, had Buddhist monks from a temple bless it, again with a mood elevation. Again, oolong tea will elevate your mood because it has some caffeine in it, but we wanted it to be elevated more, and the people getting the blessed tea. So in that case, we recruited 200 people. So we distributed the 100 bottles to one group, 100 bottles to the other group, didn't tell them what they were getting. This was double blind because the people giving the substance didn't know what the substance was. They were just told to hand this out to these people, so that they kept them blind. And then the analyst, in this case was me, I didn't know what was A and B. I just knew there was water A and water B, or TA and TB. And so I would do the analysis and then find out later which one was the real one or the blessed one. So again, we find a significant improvement in people getting the blessed chocolate. And here we also then asked each person who did get the blessed chocolate, or the tea in this case, do you think you are getting the blessed tea or not? We wanted to see what kind of placebo effect there might be in there. Also to see whether it is true in the magical traditions that belief matters. Because for people getting the blessed tea who thought they were not getting the blessed tea, did they do differently than people getting the blessed tea who thought that they did? And the answer is huge difference. People getting the blessed tea who believed that they were getting it had a very significant, very highly significant improvement in mood. People getting the blessed tea who did not think that they were getting it had exactly the same as people not getting the blessed tea at all. So a huge difference in mood that was modulated by their belief about what was going on. So now you go over to the people getting the non-blessed tea, and you ask them the same question. Do you think you were getting the blessed tea or not? For them, it was no difference. So they weren't getting a blessed tea. There was nothing to modulate. For people getting it, there was something huge to modulate. So that actually does support this idea within magical traditions that for the magic to work, you have to believe that it's going to work. Because otherwise you're blocking whatever it is that makes these things work. We have since done the similar thing using this tea or this water that had been blessed for improving the growth rate in plants, very significant, finding better growth in stem cells, so doing a cell study, and most recently, but not published yet, seeing if we can reduce the migration rate of glioblastoma cells, which is a pretty serious brain cancer. And so there, in all of these cases, yes, we found that the growing cells and growing plants in blessed water made the results much better than the same water that wasn't blessed.
Profound. It does lead into the question of breaking enchantments. We've talked a lot about making enchantments. Have you come across breaking enchantments? Is there a use case for such things?
Well, in the magical tradition, it would be called banishing. It's banishing magic. You either suspect or you know that somebody's doing something you don't particularly like, and you can banish it. So you can do a ritual to sort of block it from happening. The other type is binding magic. So binding magic is somewhere, it's like in a gray area, because what you're binding is preventing somebody from doing something that you don't particularly want them to do. So you bind them so they don't do that thing. Typically it involves binding them from doing something that would be bad, or at least that you perceive as bad. And that's why it's a gray area, because you're in that case literally overcoming their free will to do something that they're doing. But if you perceive it as they're a bad person doing stuff, you don't want them to do that. So binding magic and banishing magic are classic ways of trying to stop either a magical spell that is going in a direction you don't like, or just stopping it completely, especially if you think you're being attacked. So again, it's kind of on the edge of paranoia, except that the moment you get a sense that this stuff is real, well, now what, right? Because your belief is this stuff could hurt me. And so you have to do something to prevent it from hurting you because your belief is there. So the banishing magic is typically the way to do that. And the easiest way that people have talked about for a long time is putting up a mental shield. You put up a shield of white light or a mirror or something like that that simply protects you from it, in which case it can be highly effective. And things will not get in. Why? Because you've created what amounts to an impenetrable shield, and you believe it, and that's enough to prevent it from happening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. As we start to wrap up today's conversation, I can't help but feel. I remember when I had a conversation, the four agreements, and we talked about Toltec wisdom and the Metote, like the sort of the Maya and the illusion of the world. And yeah, it was talking about not letting other people's programs become your programs. And I can't help but, feel today's conversation is so beautiful in so many ways because, yeah, there's been a disenchantment and there's almost like a re-enchantment that's being brought into the world. And it's through your work. And I think it's really interesting, Dean, because I guess some people, like looking from the Western zeitgeist at the moment, it's like becoming disenchanted is like there's so much, there's like a draw towards grounded, but yet somewhat, I'm going to use the word empty, but grounded yet somewhat empty is probably what's coming to mind at the moment. And there's almost like a re-enchantment that's being invited in by yourself. And I couldn't help but feel when I was talking to Don Miguel Ruiz there, he said, yeah, as much as you want to decondition your mind as much as possible, when you go to have kids, you'd love to keep them as an empty slate, but you quickly realize that if you don't condition them, somebody else will. Right. And so there's a rub in there, and I think the disenchantment, re-enchantment, I couldn't help but feel that there might be parallels happening in that space, in that we want to be disenchanted and we want to see the world as it is, but is that even possible? And potentially there's always enchantments in place. And if, is it a matter of being enchanted and being enchanted in a way that feels right for us to be enchanted? Touchwood, just an open question for you.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's no easy answer to it, I think. One of the solutions that, at least that we see in the United States, is people homeschool their children, right? So if you go through homeschooling all the way up, at least through high school, and then sometimes you go to specialty colleges too, you can end up with a worldview that is extremely different from everyone else. This is mostly done within a religious context, but it can be in other contexts too. Well, so this is the parents' approach to try to get the children to perceive the world in a certain way, because that's what's going to happen. It's fine if you're living within a community where everybody else is like that, like in the U.S., like an Amish society, where people stay within a kind of a bubble there. But the question can be, well, then what is the purpose of life? Why are you? Should you be exposed to everything? Lots of things are not so good, and some things are really great. Is it better to do that, or to maintain a very constrained sense of the way things are? And I can see arguments on both sides. So that's why I don't have a good solution to this. In a sense, every adult has to make up their own decisions. One of the things I do find, though, is I know a lot of people who say that they used to be Catholic. So that they're like you're inside, you're raised within a bubble. And then typically what happens is you start to learn more and more education, you realize a lot of that stuff in the bubble doesn't make any sense at all, because that's like clashing with things that I'm learning that have some empirical basis to it, because within the bubble, it's all based on pure belief or faith. I mean, belief and faith are going to make a distinction here, because faith is, in a sense, belief without evidence. In fact, it's even worse than that. It's belief where you're not allowed to question whether it's true or not. The really strong belief is one where you say, I'm not sure I believe in that or not. I'm going to try something, and you do it and it works. Well, that's a very strong belief now because you have a reason to believe it. If you don't have a reason to believe, other than because somebody said it's written in that book, it's what I'm saying you should believe, that's pretty weak. That's why people end up staying within the bubble, because the moment you start looking outside of the bubble, you realize that stuff didn't make much sense. So there's a downside. If you want someone to be engaged with the rest of the world, they're going to learn all kinds of things. So you want to be able to get them to the point where they're able to make decisions for themselves, which, by the way, is probably around age 30. Not, like 18, forget it. 18 is, even a 20-year-old is not fully formed. They're still partially like a fetus. You want them to be at a stage where they have some understanding of the nature of the world and its complexities, and they can make some sort of informed decision. And so I always used to hear that, you hear this in scientists a lot, that, yeah, they were a really good empiricist for a very long time, but then they got to like age 60 and they became a philosopher. Well, why does that happen? It's because there is a certain degree of wisdom that comes along with age where you can kind of look back at what you were doing. A lot of, up until you're about 60, there's the family and the work and the job and everything. It's just, it's overwhelming, and you get consumed by it all because you kind of have to. Then when things lighten up a little bit, you have a chance to look back on it and start to figure out, well, what of what I was doing actually makes sense from this perspective? Well, some of it does, and some of it actually didn't or doesn't. And so one of the disadvantages of the modern life is that we don't live with 3 or 4 generations of people. Because if we did, we would hear those stories, right, from people who are now in their 70s or 80s or even older, saying,
The wisdom.
yes, what you're doing now, that's not really a good thing to do. Or maybe it would be better if you do this. And if you then respect the elders based on their wisdom, that's a much better way actually of living. But, we don't live that way anymore, except maybe in indigenous societies. And so that's a sense of something that we've lost because of the way modern civilization has gone, which it would be nice if we were able to figure out how to reconstruct that, how to make that happen again.
Dr. Dean. Wow. Thank you so much for helping us reclaim such a beautiful and mysterious part of, just reality, our relationship with our mind, its relationship with matter, understanding consciousness more fully, and just finding our place in the world in such a rich way. I will put a link to your books below. There's a new one, like you said, coming out very shortly after this episode comes out in the coming months as we step into 2025 as well. Actually, we'll go as far as when the book pops out, we'll also add that to the link in the description below for anybody listening to this episode after the effect as well. But there's there's websites, Noetic, like there's so much going on in your world as well. For people that wanted to go a little bit deeper, obviously the books are there. Any other places you'd like to recommend they check out some of this work?
Well, you can go to my personal website, which is deanradin.com, or you can go to one of my jobs, which is chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is noetic.org, which you'll have on your website. And then my other job is co-founder and chairman of a biotech company called Cognigenics, where we're creating a new kind of treatment for mild cognitive impairment, for dementia, and maybe for Alzheimer's.
Brilliant. I'll put a link to all of that in the show notes below. Dr. Dean, I want to thank you for your time and energy here today. Thank you so much for sharing yourself so abundantly here with us. Such a fascinating, illuminating conversation, but also in the same breath, I think that pales in comparison to really, you've been forging a path forward researching this stuff for 30, 40 years. And, I'm sure like now these conversations are more widespread. It's easier. They're catching like wildfire. People are interested. Whereas, when you were first scratching the itch, I'm sure it was quite uncomfortable. But you just followed your curiosity and it was interesting to you, so you did it. But I'm sure there were some external factors along the way that were probably like, what are you doing? So I just want to thank you for doing you all the way through. Really grateful for you. Thank you so much for sharing yourself here with us today.
You're welcome. A lot of superstitions are essentially magical rituals, right?
Ah.
They're pushing on your belief, and belief is such a strong modulator of this stuff that if you do it, you will believe more that this is going to help you, and then it helps you. The part of some of the magical laws are that the word is the thing. It actually is literally the word, and the symbol is the thing itself.
Ah.
And that's why in the magical traditions, you don't tell people your name. You
Oh.
have a pseudonym that is Father so and so or Freighter, fill in the blank,
Right.
because your name is identical to you.
This
So
is
you gain power.
This is trippy because, like, in the Bible, it says in the beginning there was the word. Is that a
Yeah.
magical? Whoa, no way.
Yeah, sure. The word is the thing. Yeah.
Oh
think of
my
that also like
God, there's so much to talk about in there. What?
the word spell. You cast a spell.
Mhm.
Well, what do you spell? You spell a word. It's the ingredients that go into a word.
Yeah,
So
spelling.
word,
SPELL.
yeah, spell and spelling are the same root idea, that the phonetic symbols in that case are put together in just the right way, and there are a lot of magical rituals which are saying sounds, right? Ancient Aramaic,
Yeah.
ancient Hebrew words. They're sounds that are put together in a certain way, and this essentially is the element of the Kabbalah. Kabbalah creates reality as a result of certain words.
Isn't that interesting? Because there's even the study of like neurolinguistic programming, which is looking backwards almost in on yourself based on words and body language and behavior, which is like, this is what you're saying,
Yeah.
this is what your body language is doing, and like decoding almost what the spell is. Really interesting because, yeah, I trained in all that stuff for for coaching, but this is, yeah, I wish the podcast wasn't over. Okay, to be done again in the future. Thank you again so much for your time, dude. You inspired soul, you made it through to the end of another incredible episode. Thank you so much for your inspirations to evolve. Just a friendly reminder to all of you that everything you see around here it's powered and empowered by your subscription to the channel. So if you wouldn't mind, please taking a moment, there's a bell notification and a subscribe button just below. If you can hit the subscribe button, it's lighting up in the colors of the Inspired Evolution, and hit that bell notification icon. It supports everything we're doing here, championing the love of positivity, wisdom around the world. And also to all of you that are subscribed to the channel, we recently hit 100,000 subscribers. Thank you so much for your incredible love and support. It is such an honor, Touchwood, to be your brother, doing this work, walking this path by your side. Thank you so much for your blessings. And with that, on screen right about now is your opportunity to continue your inspirations flowing and evolving, going deeper, continue to inspire your evolution inwards, upwards, onwards. So here we go. Take a pic of one of these videos and I'll see you in the next one.